I'm so used to like Smash Brothers mechanics. I'm so used to that. Yeah, it's like when you play like multiple different games and then each like game has like different controls. That's the thing when you play 2D platformers is you kind of have to like relearn all the controls. That's the thing, like has there like ever been situations where you've ended up replaying like a game and then like because the controls are different to like how you're used to, the game ends up being harder as a result? I don't know, I feel like there has been quite a handful of situations in games where I'm like that again, where like the controls are like so different from what I'm used to that it actually ends up screwing me over. I've had that situation a lot. I've had a lot of situations where like I replay a video game and then because I'm again played so many modern games that it just ends up kind of screwing me over in the long term. Tutorials should always be optional. A lot of video games, because a lot of people just love to like power through everything, they just end up making every tutorial completely mandatory by default. And that's an issue that actually kind of makes a lot of, not Pokemon games, but video games just in general a little bit worse. Like if you've already played the game, then there's like absolutely no reason to have the tutorial in the first place, because like, again, you've already played through the entire game, or you've already played through an entirely similar game. You shouldn't need to like have to sit through however many minutes of controls just to learn again, because the game just assumes that you're a first-time player. The fact that every single game is built in that regard kind of like hurts the replayability of a lot of newer video games. Again, if a game does something totally different that it kind of warrants relearning the controls, yeah, I get it. Because it's a totally different gameplay loop, you're gonna wanna have to like relearn the controls. But at the same time, like if it's got the same overall controls, if it's got the same controls, it's got the same mechanics as the previous game before it and like the previous 6 games, you shouldn't have to sit through essentially like an hour-long or 2-hour-long tutorial just because the game assumes that you're a first-time player. That's like the worst part of tutorials in video games, is when every single game kind of is like, oh, you're probably a first-time player, I'm gonna make you sit through the tutorial even if you've already played through that game in the first place. Like, that's the thing that really annoys me. That's actually the reason why I think a lot of old-school video game, like older video games like this game, and then there's like, you know, Mario 64 even if the controls and the camera have not aged well, in short, aged like milk. And like even Banjo-Kazooie, I do probably plan on replaying other video games in the future. Like, I'm gonna probably have more of a focus on Nintendo 64 games. I'd probably be open on kind of branching out to like Nintendo Switch games, or even just maybe like replaying some Wii U games, because again, I still have a Wii U console. But yeah, like I have quite a lot of Nintendo Switch games. I would be probably open to maybe doing like a replay through of them at some point in the future. I don't want to like exclusively do this challenge. Like I want to kind of like vary up the content a bit, so I'm not, you know, doing the exact same thing, because otherwise like it's just gonna get stale. Like you're gonna see like the same thing like for the next 20 streams, and again, I kind of want to vary it up, you know? Variety is like the best thing. I want to like have this kind of like as my primary thing for now, and then on the days I do a short stream, what I can do then is I can just basically branch out and kind of do like a bunch of like different games. So like, you know, the short streams can be focused on the smaller games. Like let's say a casual playthrough of Banjo-Kazooie, for example. Those could be the short stream material. That way then it will be like easier. People can then like watch it, you know, if people don't want to like watch through like 6 hours of footage of a stream, for example, like the 2-hour footage, and then like it'll also be easier to kind of like archive it and basically, you know, talk to others. Because again, like the levels in Banjo-Kazooie typically are fairly short, so like, you know, you could do 1-2 levels per stream, and I feel like that might be a really good thing. I feel like Mario 64 would also be, I mean, even if I don't prefer it as much as Banjo-Kazooie, I feel like that would also be really good, because again, you would be able to like, being able to play games which are better for like short bursts would be better for short streams. So I'd be kind of like open to kind of varying up the content depending on the game itself. I'd also be open to like maybe playing some like newer games. I'd be again open to talking to chat, kind of like, you know, reacting to videos or something like that. I'd be open to that. I'm absolutely dreading the Later King DDD sections, so the desert one is already kind of like unnerving enough, but trust me when I say that it gets so much worse. Yeah, Nintendo Switch games, a lot of people love the whole like big AAA open world games. I have never been a fan of the big AAA open world games. I'm not a big fan of like gigantic games in general, just because they're good for like long form content maybe, but like they're not good for like short form content because you have to commit such an insane amount of time to those games. And sometimes like you have to really like be willing to invest very large amount of time into those games. Breath of the Wild, I mean Horizon Zero Dawn, Tears of the Kingdom, like any like truly massive game, you have to like be mentally prepared to like sink a lot of time in those games. And often like a lot of open world games I feel like are a little too empty, if that makes sense. I feel like a lot of things that a lot of open world games tend to have the habit of suffering from. It's just a very bland, empty world. And that's like the one thing you don't want in an open world game. Yeah, you don't want like overwhelm the player just by having like an insane amount of like insanely large world and then just having like things very like sparsely placed out. I feel like that's an easy way to kind of like turn off certain players. Like obviously like yeah, there are some players who enjoy having like an utterly gigantic open world game. But I feel like if you're making an open world game, like first of all, like you got to keep the size at least. You got to keep the size modest, and you got to keep the size like you got to keep the content density at least dense enough to keep players engaged, but not too dense to overwhelm the player. But you also don't want it to be too empty so as then like it's just empty space that you're just crossing over and over again. Also, traversal. I think traversal is like another big factor as to why open world games tend to be kind of a mixed bag for me. I don't like spending like half the playthrough essentially just traveling and nothing else, because that's like an easy way for me to like lose engagement with an open world game. Breath of the Wild especially kind of like suffered from that problem. It just, for me, it just didn't have any content to keep me engaged, because it just like, again, a lot of it, like the Great Plateau was an amazing tutorial section, as is the Great Sky Island. Like the tutorial sections are really good, but like after that, I feel like the difficulty and like the quality of the game just kind of started to flatline a little bit. Again, the Great Plateau, amazing tutorial that teaches you kind of like all the core mechanics of the game. The problem with Breath of the Wild is it's not really a Legend of Zelda game in spirit, because the gameplay is just so wildly different. I think the only thing that Breath of the Wild has in common with Zelda games is kind of like characters to an extent. I think that is literally the only thing the game has in common. Like, it has characters in common, but that's like pretty much it. You don't have heart container pieces. I mean, they instead replace them with kind of spirit orbs, which I think is, again, for an open world game, I guess kind of makes sense, but like it kind of like removes a lot of what makes Zelda Zelda. And then there's also like, there's no permanent abilities. The weapons breaking is like, again, one of my major pet peeves of Breath of the Wild. I feel like anyone who's kind of a detractor of Breath of the Wild can kind of confirm that, yeah, the weapon durability system is not the best implemented. Breath of the Wild should have really had like a full-on like crafting system instead of just being limited exclusively to cooking meals. And I feel like even cooking meals essentially kind of like trivializes the entire game. Genshin Impact kind of rectifies it by essentially the player having essentially a fullness meter. And then, yeah, the fullness meter essentially is like the player can only eat however many times. Once they've eaten enough food, they can't end up eating again. And I feel like that's a big factor into why Genshin Impact, I feel like, yeah, Genshin Impact, I'm not a big fan of like gacha games in general. But yeah, for me, Breath of the Wild does a lot of things right. The problem with Breath of the Wild is it does a lot of things wrong though. And I feel like the shrines are probably like the biggest thing that hold the game back, in my honest opinion. I feel like the shrines are a little bit too easy. Yeah, the shrines kind of like end up making the game way too easy, in my opinion. Nope. What if I... Oh, I was trying to like use the downwards attack to try and get rid of him. That sucks. Well, attempt number 13. Yeah, Breath of the Wild. I feel like every single shrine could have afforded to be at least as long as the tutorial shrines, and then they just decided not to. And I feel like that's one of like the big weak links of the game. They could have done so much more with the shrines, and then they just kind of chose not to. I do like the concept of the shrines. I don't like the execution. I feel like Tears of the Kingdom did them both better and worse compared to Breath of the Wild. Now, don't get me wrong, Breath of the Wild had some truly amazing shrines in like trial quests in like Blue Flame and the Thunder Plateau. The problem is that it was just so few and far between that, like, again, it's so easy to like notice the bad shrines when you see them. There's like an oversaturation of the Test of Strength shrines. Again, the Test of Strength shrines would have been fine if they were a lot more varied compared to like Breath of the Wild. Ooh. Yeah, again, really, that's how I take damage. Damn it. Well, attempt number 14. Some of the shrines in Breath of the Wild are actually like really good, and I feel like, again, Eventide Island is like the best one in the whole game for good reason. Eventide Island really just kind of like, it took what makes Breath of the Wild without just completely destroying the core mechanics of the game. Breath of the Wild's Eventide Island is probably the best aspect of the entire game. There's also Thunder at Plateau, but then again, the difficulty of that is the fact it's always raining and thunderstorming, and so the difficult aspect of that comes from the fact that like makes it much easier if you can just kind of paraglide to the tallest area where one of the orbs is, because then that kind of like ends up making it really easy. But yeah, I think Thunder Plateau is probably one of the better shrines in the game. Again, I feel like there are some really good like puzzle shrines in Breath of the Wild, but then the problem is like so many of the puzzle shrines are just kind of like one thing and then done. It's just kind of like a one and done thing. So like, you know, Shadow of the Heavens is just like a double bomb, a very, very basic double bomb shrine, but then there's like nothing else to it like afterwards. Breath of the Wild is kind of in an odd spot in my opinion. There are some shrines in Breath of the Wild that are like incredibly easy, again, and then there are just some that are like, why are they here? The game suffers from having too many Tested Strength shrines and too many Blessing shrines are what really hold the game back. Not necessarily too many Blessing shrines, but too many Blessing shrines that are just kind of unnecessary for like what you have to go through. Like, oh, you discover this like slightly hidden cave, boom, you get a Blessing shrine. I feel like that's a very poor way of rewarding play, because it makes like some shrines, the kind of like benefit does not outweigh the like what you have to invest. Again, some shrines are like, you know, to get to some shrines are like low risk, but then like the reward is really high, or even like free. And then you have like the shrines are incredibly difficult, and then like they don't give you a good enough like reward afterwards. And I feel like that's a thing that plagues Breath of the Wild a lot. Also the fact that like everything just has a habit of just kind of like looking the same. I mean, yeah, there are some distinct areas like Hebra, you got the Gerudo region and whatnot, and then you got like Death Mountain, the entirety is Zora's Domain, and then the Faron Woods area. But like, I feel like there are some areas that do kind of have a habit of just kind of like blending into each other and not in a good way, and then that kind of like holds the game back slightly. And then like the Divine Beasts, I will say right away that Thunderblight Ganon and the whole like Gerudo side quest is easily the best one in the entire game for a pretty good reason. The fact that like they combine like several different aspects and they have a genuinely fun Divine Beast combat section is what elevates it. And then also having like a Divine Beast where like with the main gimmick of the Divine Beast, you actually have to think. Like, again, electrical circuitry puzzle shrines are like the best shrines in Breath of the Wild, and the fact that you have an entire Divine Beast kind of like centered around that mechanic is really cool. Which is why I typically either do the Divine Beast Boris last, or I just end up doing the Divine Beast Boris only, and then like none of the other Divine Beasts. I will say, like, for being the hardest Divine Beast and for being overall the hardest quest in the game, they do give you like the best ability in the game in Abosa's Fury, like literally with the right setup. Like you can just basically Stasis plus Silver Lionel and then just kind of combine Abosa's Fury in like the strongest weapon you can, and then just kind of like immediately nuke it into oblivion. That is totally a thing you can do. I think my least favorite Divine Beast is definitely Divine Beast Marmadeau. I think Marmadeau is like the easiest Divine Beast. It has like the simplest pre-Divine Beast quest compared to all of them, but it does give you like probably the most useful traversal ability in the game. I would actually say like the first Divine Beast you should probably go for if you're playing through Breath of the Wild is Meadow, simply because again, having free updrafts is really useful. I do, however, think that the Sage abilities have done a lot worse in Tears of the Kingdom. There's Tulin's Gust, which is like the one reasonably good one, but then the problem with the Sage abilities, I feel like it implemented a lot worse than Breath of the Wild's kind of like more passive passive abilities. But yeah, the passive abilities, again, you have Chillin's Gust, which, again, very, very useful for traversal. You have Yunobo's attack. Again, I absolutely dislike Yunobo's attack. Again, the way they implemented it is the problem. Yunobo does not have a fun ability to use. Prince Sidon's ability is essentially like a reusable Daruk's protection, but I feel like Sidon's Sage ability, again, isn't necessary. Like, yeah, it can keep you cool in the desert, and, like, that's probably, like, the one major thing. But, like, honestly, you're probably just better off using heat-resistant equipment in the first place. But, yeah, I feel like... And then you also have, like, the Splash property that was introduced in Tears of the Kingdom as well. I think the worst one, though, has to be, like... The problem is Riju. A free lightning attack where an arrow hits is really cool, but, like... Not only do you have to, like, charge it up, but then you also have to, you know, kind of fire it in time, otherwise they just kind of like remove the kind of like charge effect you've actually put up. In my opinion, yeah, the Sage abilities, I think it's actually more enjoyable to play Tears of the Kingdom and not doing any of the, you know, regional phenomena quests, because I feel like then the whole boss rush gauntlet is actually worse off with all the sages. Yeah, I prefer having like the boss rush. I feel like, yeah, having a bunch of like meandering fools wandering around is just, I don't like having a bunch of like NPCs, like, again, with questionable AI just kind of running amok. And I feel like, again, like, the dubious AI really, like, makes it worse to deal with them. Because, like, there are so many situations where, like, you're trying to do one specific strategy and then they do something else that, like, completely undermines the whole strategy when you don't want it to. But yeah, because again, like the way I dealt with the final boss rush is essentially, again, ice and electric weapons are still broken. I feel like that is one kind of major criticism from Breath of the Wild, is what was broken in Breath of the Wild is still broken in Tears of the Kingdom. Tears of the Kingdom, unfortunately, like, I feel like it's easier to abuse those mechanics, especially because of like new like weapon bases and weapon types. But that's just kind of like me. I feel like, again, for me, the early game is like, again, very, very, very difficult. It's not what I say is like, you know, balance. There are some hard areas of Tears of the Kingdom, don't get me wrong, like the depths. The depths are going to be hard, like, again, because of all like the gloom vomited everywhere. I think the depths, though, is definitely one of the more interesting parts of the game for me, because again, like the amiibo collectibles you can still get them through the amiibo, but like you don't have to use an amiibo every single time you want to try and get that item, which I think is a really good thing. The fact that you can get all the amiibo items is a really fun little bonus. I think Tears of the Kingdom kind of like rectify a lot of the issues of like Breath of the Wild to a certain extent. I do think there are some elements of the game that are still kind of like, this game kind of doubled down on what made Breath of the Wild Breath of the Wild, but I feel like, again, Fuse is a massive improvement on the game. Again, it answered all my criticisms with the whole like questionable combat system in Breath of the Wild. Again, how like the weapons break. That way then, because Fuse is a thing, it actually gives you kind of an incentive to kind of like defeat enemies and figure out like, you know, what does this enemy's body part do? And like figuring out like, you know, because there are certain enemy parts that like what you do is you fuse an enemy horn to your sword or your axe or your spear. And then what you do then is you end up then creating your own weapon. And then what you do then is you kind of like capitalize on that. You take out a more powerful enemy, you gain a more powerful enemy horn part, you combine that to another weapon, and then you take out an even more powerful enemy, and it's just kind of like a gameplay loop that's engaging. It's very Monster Hunter-esque. You're gradually grinding against progressively stronger enemies to get progressively stronger parts. It also kind of like solves a big issue with people, which people will like just not use their stronger stuff, even if it's like, even if it makes more sense to like use the stronger weapons. People just hoard them for that one time, where it's going to be useful, and then they never end up using those weapons. The game really needed like kind of like a crafting or a skill tree system which kind of incentivize actually engaging in combat, because in Breath of the Wild you get to the point where you just kind of like, and they fall for the biggest trap in like every open world game, which is to make the enemies stronger, they just make them bulkier in the health department. They just soak up so much durability of your weapons, so much health. I got to the point where I just actively avoided combat in Breath of the Wild because there's no point in like investing more than like 2 weapons to defeat like one enemy, because I knew like even with my strongest weapons, even if I combine attack multipliers and whatnot, again, I consume more weapons than I gain back. And the weapons I gain back are weaker anyway, so like, why even bother? You wanna know what they should have done? Enemies drop rupees depending on their strength. That way then, early on, there is actually an incentive to end up defeating progressively stronger enemies. By defeating stronger enemies like Lionel, like your choo-choos or your keys, they're only going to drop like 1 rupee, for example. Like, they're not going to drop a lot of like rewards. But if you're taking on like stronger weapons like, you know, your silver moblins and your silver Lizalfos and whatnot, or like even like your black tier enemies, then what the game's going to reward you by basically giving you more rupees. I feel like there should have been a little bit more incentive to actually battling enemies. And I feel like that was the biggest mistake, because there's like no reason to take on enemies after a certain point in the game, like unless you want weapons, but like you probably are going to consume more weapons than you're going to gain, and the weapons you gain back are probably going to be weaker in comparison. At the end of the day, I think that's like what you really don't want in a video game. It comes down to like a risk reward system, you know, low risk, low reward, high risk, high reward. Like, if a player's going to take a huge risk, they should get a huge reward from it in comparison. You should not end up gimping the player in the rewards department by like, oh yeah, you invested X amount of time defeating X amount of enemy, so your reward is going to be that you essentially don't get rewarded. That is the worst thing you can do in any video game, is like have the player invest so much time and then just like not reward the player at all. That's like the most gut-wrenching feeling in any video game, because you like invest however much time. You invest like 1 hour trying to like defeat an enemy. Let's say you invest like an hour trying to like solve a puzzle and you get like no reward from it. That's such a horrible feeling, because like, oh, you invested all of this time, like you invested all this time, all this resources just to get like a nothing burger. And that's the thing that really irritates me. That's the thing that like always irks me, is that like people think, oh, that's fine. Like, it's fine to have like a very crappy, you know, oh, you invested 6 hours and you get nothing out of it. No, I disagree with that so much. Yeah, it's actually why I like a lot of like older games. Like some older games, yeah, it's like a high risk, but you get like rewarded for taking that risk. Again, it comes down to risk and reward. And I feel like, again, a lot of newer video games are like, they just copy the same reward over and over again, but just like, again, then the challenge varies, and that's like not what you do to make an engaging video game. I do like fast traveling, but I don't think fast traveling should have ever been a kind of get out of jail free card. I think that, like, again, very heavily trivializes a lot of combat elements of the game, because you just, like, oh, if you're about to die, you just warp away. Pokemon Legends Arceus kind of did a, like, good way of doing that. Like, when a Pokemon ends up aggroing on you, you can't walk away just to, like, avoid getting taken out. Like, you have to try and escape and wait until, you know, that aggro sense is gone. And once you've de-aggroed that enemy, only then can you end up fast traveling. That way then, if you get yourself in a troublesome situation, that's on you, and you have to like get out of that troublesome situation yourself. You don't just like abuse a mechanic to completely trivialize it. That's the best part of Pokemon Legends Arceus. The combat is better than Breath of the Wild, because again, you can't just abuse mechanics that would absolutely break the game. They actually do put limitations on the mechanics, and as this, the mechanic fires headphones. It also fires projectiles if you're underwater. They're like, yeah, the crystal shards, we're gonna go like that, and we're gonna lure that down. Yeah, that's a massive flipping trap. Basically, like, if you try and like swim straight up, that just falls right on your head, and then you end up taking damage. This is the 4th level of Rockstar. New Pete, a new personal best. Yeah, this is kind of a scary section. Oh, please, keep going. Come on. Oh, that's not what I wanted to happen. I should have just... And then we get another crystal shard. Drop down, jump. Do we get another instance of bomb? Oh, hopefully we can get bomb and backtrack. I could brute force, but like, it's not worth it. I'm not brute forcing. Yeah, I don't think we're getting bomb. I think we have to like import bomb through another level. That sucks. I guess we're having to redo the whole level, I suppose, huh? Is this enemy, dude? This is gonna go with that. I made a mistake. That one's on me. Well, you've reached the end of this video, so why not like the video and leave a comment, as it helps out the channel a lot. And make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on the next video. Also, follow me on Twitter and Twitch, as I post daily on Twitter and I stream all this content live on Twitch. Links are in the description below. But for now, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely day.